The great hall of the capital was silent. Queen Eleanor stood on the high steps, her crown heavy on her head, her voice steady as she spoke. She called for men and women to rise and defend the far colony of Arden. The threat was near, and she needed warriors to protect her people. Her words carried through the hall, but no one answered. Around her, the nobles and generals shifted uncomfortably. They looked at one another, but not at her. They whispered excuses. Some claimed they were too old. Others said they had duties elsewhere. One by one, they turned their faces away. Their polished armor and rich robes meant nothing in that moment. Fear and pride made them weak. The queen's call hung in the air like an unanswered prayer. In the crowd stood Daniel Carter. He was not dressed in fine clothes. His armor was worn, and his boots were scuffed. He had no titles and no lands, only scars from past battles that few remembered. He had fought in small wars on distant borders, but no one in the hall knew his name. He listened to the queen, and in her voice he heard not command but desperation. He saw her standing alone as her people abandoned her. Despite the silence of the others, Daniel stepped forward. His steps echoed on the stone floor, louder than all the murmurs. The nobles glanced at him with frowns. Who was this man with no rank? What right did he have to step forward when lords and generals had turned away? But Daniel did not stop. He came to the foot of the steps and bowed his head. "My queen," he said, his voice strong and clear, "I will answer your call." Queen Eleanor looked down at him. Her eyes widened with surprise. One soldier, only one, stood before her, while the rest of the hall shrank into shadows. She saw no fear in his face, only resolve. For a moment, the weight on her heart eased. Even in the midst of betrayal, hope had taken shape. The hall filled with whispers. Some laughed under their breath. Some muttered that the queen had fallen so low that only a common soldier would stand for her. But the queen raised her hand and the whispers stopped. She stepped down the steps until she stood before Daniel. "You would go to Arden?" she asked softly, though no others will. "Yes, my queen," Daniel said. "If none will stand, then I will stand." The people of Arden should not be left without defenders. There was silence again, but it was not the same silence as before. This time, it was heavy with shame. The nobles who had looked away now shifted uneasily, their faces flushed with guilt, though none moved to follow Daniel's lead. Their pride held them in place, even as they felt the sting of his courage. Queen Eleanor placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. "Your name is not known in this hall, but your loyalty speaks louder than any title. You will not stand alone. I will send what I can, but you will lead this cause." Daniel nodded. He did not feel great or noble. He felt only the weight of duty. Still, there was no hesitation in his heart. He would go to Arden. He would fight, even if it meant standing alone. As he stepped back, the queen looked out once more at the silent crowd. Their eyes were lowered. None dared to meet her gaze. She lifted her chin with dignity and spoke again. "Let it be known," she said, "that when the kingdom turned away, one warrior remained true." And so the hall that had once been filled with silence now carried the echo of one man's vow. It was the beginning of a story that would spread far beyond those stone walls. A simple soldier had answered when others would not, and in his answer, the fate of Arden had begun to change. Daniel left the great hall with the queen's words still echoing in his mind. Outside the tall walls of the capital, life went on as if nothing had changed. Merchants shouted in the market, children ran through the streets, and guards stood at their posts. Yet Daniel felt the weight of a promise pressing against his chest. He had spoken in front of the queen and all her nobles. Now he had to live that vow. His quarters were small and plain. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the old sword resting against the wall. It had seen battles but was chipped and worn. He touched the hilt and remembered the friends he had lost in forgotten skirmishes. Those friends had no statues, no songs. They had only given their lives quietly. Daniel swore to himself that if he must fall, he would fall for something greater than silence. The next morning, word spread through the capital. A single soldier had stepped forward when all others refused. Some mocked the news, calling it foolish pride. Others felt shame, whispering that one man had shown more courage than all the lords together. Common folk began to speak his name with respect, though he never asked for it. To them he was not a hero, but proof that loyalty still lived. Soon, a few came to find him. Claire, a young medic, knocked on his door. She had seen men die and could not bear to let him march alone. She carried no sword, only her satchel of bandages and herbs. Her hands trembled when she spoke, yet her voice was steady. "I will come with you. The wounded will need care, and if you fall, someone must tell your story." Daniel looked into her eyes and saw no fear, only quiet strength. He nodded and welcomed her. Later that day, Matthew, a thoughtful man who once studied war but never led an army, approached Daniel in the training yard, carried maps and scribbled notes, his fingers stained with ink. "I have no skill with a blade," Matthew said, "but I know how to build traps, how to use the land to our favor. If you will have me, I can help defend Arden." Daniel clasped his shoulder in thanks. He knew wisdom could save as many lives as steel. Ethan was the last to join. A scout with sharp eyes and quick feet, he had spent years moving unseen through forests and hills. He heard of Daniel's vow and felt called to follow. "A warrior who stands alone will soon fall," Ethan said simply. "If he has eyes and ears around him, he may endure." Daniel smiled for the first time in days. His small band was forming, not of nobles or great generals, but of people with willing hearts. Still, whispers followed them through the streets. Many believed they would never return. Some said they would shame the queen by failing. Yet as the four walked side by side, they carried a quiet resolve. Daniel never promised victory, only that he would not abandon those in need. Before their departure, Queen Eleanor met them in the courtyard. Her robes were plain, and her crown rested lightly on her head. She looked at each of them in turn, her voice low but filled with pride. "You may be few, but you carry the honor of the kingdom. Arden will know that it was not forgotten. Go with courage and know that my faith goes with you." She handed Daniel a banner of the kingdom, its fabric worn but strong. "Carry this so that the people may know they are not alone." The journey began at dawn. The city gates opened and they stepped onto the long road. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky with pale gold. Behind them, the capital faded into the distance. Ahead lay fields, forests, and dangers they could not yet name. Daniel walked at the front, the banner resting on his shoulder, his old sword at his side. Claire walked close, her satchel heavy, but her steps steady. Matthew studied the land around them, already marking rivers and hills in his mind. Ethan moved quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert to every shadow. They were small in number, but their hearts beat with purpose. As the road stretched on, Daniel thought of the silence in the great hall. He thought of the nobles who turned away, and of the queen who had placed her trust in him. He did not know if he would live to see Arden safe, but he knew this: he would never turn away. And for the first time, he did not walk alone. The road to Arden stretched for many days. The land was wide and open at first, with fields of wheat and small villages where children played near the wells. People came out of their homes when they saw the banner of the kingdom. Some bowed their heads, some touched the fabric as it passed, and some whispered blessings. To them, the sight of even a small band carrying the queen's mark gave hope. Daniel did not speak much, but he held the banner high so all could see it. As the days passed, the land grew harsher. Forests thick with shadows lined their path. The air turned colder, and the wind carried strange sounds at night. Claire kept close to the fire, her hands working to clean and pack her herbs. Matthew often bent over his maps, drawing marks and studying the shape of the rivers and hills. Ethan slipped often into the trees, returning with news of the path ahead. Daniel walked with steady steps, always watching, always ready. Trouble came sooner than they expected. One evening as the sun set, Ethan returned quickly, his face tense. "We are being followed," he said. "A group of men track us from the woods." Daniel looked to Matthew, who asked, "Bandits?" Ethan nodded. "They wait for darkness." The group moved to a small clearing. Matthew knelt and studied the ground. He pointed to fallen logs and narrow paths. "We can use this place," he said. "It will come for our supplies." "I let them think us unready," Daniel agreed. Claire hid behind the logs with her satchel, her heart beating fast, but her hands steady. Ethan vanished into the trees again. When night fell, the bandits came. They rushed from the woods with blades and shouts, thinking to frighten a small band of travelers. But they met more than they expected. Ethan struck first, leaping from the dark to knock one down. Matthew's traps slowed others, ropes and branches pulling them off their feet. Daniel met the rest head-on, his old sword flashing in the firelight. He fought not with grace but with steady strength, every strike pushing them back. Claire moved quickly, binding the arm of a wounded bandit who cried out in pain. She showed no fear, only focus. One of the bandits saw her kindness and dropped his blade, shamed by her courage. The fight ended with the rest fleeing into the night, undared to face Daniel again. When it was over, the firelight glowed on their tired faces. Claire washed blood from her hands, her eyes calm, though her body shook. Matthew spoke softly. "We won because we trusted each other." Ethan nodded in agreement. Daniel said little, but in his heart he felt pride. Not for himself, but for the strength of those who stood with him. They rested little, for danger was still near. As they traveled on, they saw villages burned and fields empty. People fled with what little they could carry. Some wept when they saw the banner and begged for help. Daniel gave what food he could spare, and Claire tended to the wounded along the road. Matthew and Ethan promised the villagers that Arden still stood, and that the Queen had not forgotten them. At night, when the others slept, Daniel sat awake by the fire. He thought of the hall, where all had turned away, thought of the Queen, who trusted him with so much. He feared the weight was too heavy for one man, yet when he looked at Claire, Matthew, and Ethan sleeping near the flames, he felt less alone. He was no longer a single soldier, he was part of something larger. The days stretched into weeks. The land grew rougher, with mountains rising in the distance. Storms swept across the sky, slowing their steps. Still they pushed forward. Claire's laughter sometimes broke the silence, giving warmth to the cold air. Matthew's careful plans kept them from walking into danger. Ethan's sharp eyes found safe paths through the rocks and trees. Daniel carried the banner through wind and rain, never letting it fall. At last, from a high ridge, they saw the smoke of Arden rising into the sky. The colony lay ahead, broken walls and scattered homes in the distance. The people inside waited for hope that had not yet come. Daniel looked at his companions, and without words they knew. The time for travel was over. The time to stand had begun. The colony of Arden stood weak and tired when Daniel and his small band arrived. The walls were broken in many places, the gates bent and scarred. The people inside looked thin and afraid, their clothes torn and their faces lined with worry. Many had already given up hope, waiting for the day they would be forced to surrender. When they saw the banner of the Queen, carried high in Daniel's hand, their eyes widened. Some gasped, some wept, and some fell to their knees in thanks. Even a small sign of hope was more than they had dreamed. Daniel spoke with the leaders of the colony. They were farmers and miners, not soldiers. They told him their weapons were few, and their courage had faded. Daniel listened, and then said in a calm voice, "If we stand together, we can hold this ground. We will not let Arden fall without a fight." His words were simple, but they carried weight. The people, seeing his steady face, felt a spark of strength return. Matthew studied the broken walls and the hills around the colony. He gathered the men and women, showing them how to set traps, how to use the land to slow the enemy. Ethan scouted the ridges and valleys, marking paths where attackers might come. Claire tended to the sick and wounded, her gentle hands giving comfort even in the darkest hour. Daniel moved among the people, lifting beams, carrying stones, and working side by side with them. He showed them that he was not above their labor, that he would stand with them in every task. Nights were filled with fear, for the enemy was near. From the watchtowers they could see fires glowing on the horizon. Whispers spread among the settlers that doom was coming. Yet each time fear rose, Daniel reminded them, "We are not alone. We stand together, and that is enough." His voice did not rise in speeches, but in steady presence. He ate what they ate, slept where they slept, and shared their burdens. Slowly, the people began to believe. The first attack came at dawn. A wave of enemies rushed the broken walls, shouting and striking with force. The settlers trembled, but Daniel was already on the wall, his sword in hand. He shouted for them to hold their ground. Arrows flew, stones were cast, and Matthew's traps caught the attackers by surprise. Ethan guided fighters through hidden paths, striking from the side. Claire ran between the fallen, her hands never still as she bound wounds and spoke words of courage. Watch. The defenders pushed the enemy back, and for the first time in months, the people of Arden saw victory. The battle did not end there. Day after day, more waves came. The walls shook, the ground burned, and the air filled with cries. Still the colony held. Daniel fought until his arms ached, his armor dented, and his sword chipped, but he did not falter. When fear threatened to break the settlers, he stood in front of them and reminded them of the Queen's banner that still flew above the gate. "This flag means you are not forgotten," he said. "Stand with me and we will not fall." The settlers found strength in his courage. Farmers who once only held plows now gripped spears with steady hands. Miners who once swung hammers in darkness now struck with fire in their hearts. Even children carried water and food to the fighters. Arden was no longer a place of despair, but a place of resistance. The enemy grew more furious with each failed attack. They sent larger forces, breaking the gates and tearing the walls apart. Yet each time, Daniel and his band stood firm. Claire's hands grew raw, Matthew's maps filled with new marks. Ethan's eyes burned from sleepless nights, but none gave in. They had come to Arden to stand, and they would not turn away. One evening, after a long day of battle, the people gathered around Daniel. Their clothes were torn, their bodies tired, but their voices were strong. They chanted his name, not as a hero above them, but as one of their own. Daniel felt his chest tighten, not with pride, but with the heavy truth that he carried their hope. He looked at Claire, Matthew, and Ethan, and he knew they all felt the same. Together, they had turned fear into fire. As night fell, the fires of the enemy still burned beyond the hills. Another attack would come, stronger than the last. Arden would not bend easily now. Its people stood ready. Their faith bound to the banner above the gate, and to the soldier who had lifted it when all others turned away. The battle for Arden reached its height when the largest force yet came against the colony. The ground shook under their march, and the sky filled with smoke. The settlers gathered with fear in their eyes, but Daniel stood before them, the banner of the Queen rising high in his hand. His voice was calm and steady. "Today we stand as one. No matter what comes, we will not turn away." When the enemy charged, the fight raged across the broken walls and through the narrow streets. Daniel was everywhere, his sword flashing as he blocked and struck. Matthew guided defenders to strong points, shouting orders that kept the lines from breaking. Ethan darted through alleys and rooftops, striking swiftly before vanishing into shadow. Claire never stopped moving, her hands covered in blood as she bound wounds and pulled the fallen back to safety. The settlers fought with all their strength, not as soldiers, but as people who had found something worth protecting. For hours the battle roared. The gates fell, houses burned, and the colony shook with cries and fire. Daniel's arms grew heavy, his armor cracked, but still, he pressed forward. When the enemy tried to raise their own banners on the walls, Daniel tore them down and lifted the Queen's flag higher, its colors shining through smoke and dust. The sight of it gave the people strength, and they roared with one voice, driving back their foes. At last, the enemy faltered. Wave after wave had broken against the stubborn will of Arden. When the sun began to rise, the ground outside the colony was covered with silence. The attackers retreated into the hills, leaving the defenders standing weary but unbroken. The settlers looked at each other with disbelief. Against all odds they had held. Word of the victory spread quickly. Messengers rode back to the capital, telling the story of a single warrior who had answered when all others refused. The tale grew in every telling, but the truth was simple. One man as vow had lit a fire that no army could put out. The Queen herself rode to Arden days later, her guard behind her, her eyes filled with pride and sorrow for what her people had endured. When she entered the battered gates, the settlers gathered to greet her. Daniel stood at the front, his sword chipped, his armor dented, and the Queen's banner still in his hand. He bowed low, but the Queen stepped forward and lifted him up. "Rise, Daniel Carter," she said, her voice strong so all could hear. "You have given this kingdom more than any title or rank." When all others turned away, you answered, "And because of you, Arden stands." The people cheered, their voices rising like thunder. Claire, Matthew, and Ethan stood beside Daniel, their faces lit with quiet pride. They knew the Queen's words were for them as well, for none could have held without the other. The settlers wept and shouted, lifting their hands in joy. For the first time in a long while, hope filled every corner of Arden. The queen ordered supplies and soldiers to guard the colony, but she spoke again to Daniel in private. "You have done what none else dared," she told him. "You have reminded us all that courage is not found in crowns or titles, but in the heart that chooses to stand when others will not." Daniel bowed again, his voice quiet. "I am only a soldier, my queen. I did what was needed." She looked at him with a smile touched by sadness. "That is why your name will be remembered." As the sun set over Arden, the banner of the queen still flew above the gate, torn but unbroken. The settlers sang songs of victory, their voices strong with new life. Daniel stood among them, not above them, knowing he had kept his vow. He had answered the call when no one else would, and in doing so, he had given his people more than safety. He had given them faith that even in the darkest hour, one heart, one choice, could change the fate of many. And so, the story of Arden was carried across the kingdom, told in villages, towns, and cities. Wherever people gathered, they spoke of the queen who was not abandoned, and of the warrior who would not turn away.